There is a point in some relationships where you don't stop loving someone. You stop asking about them. You stop asking what they need, what changed, what they're carrying, what matters now that didn't matter before. Not because you don't care, because you think you already know. And that quiet certainty is one of the easiest ways to start losing someone while still living beside them. Because the moment you stop asking who someone is, you start relating to who you think they are. And those two people are not always the same. Today, I want to show you 7 specific assumptions that do exactly that. 7 things people stop questioning, and what quietly happens when they do. None of them feel like problems while they're happening. That's what makes them worth understanding. My name is Daniel Mercer, and one of the things I've observed consistently in how relationships lose their closeness over time is that it rarely happens through conflict. It happens through certainty. When two people become certain they know each other, they stop doing the things that created that knowledge in the first place. They stop being curious. They stop checking. They stop updating the picture they have of the other person. And people change. Slowly, continuously, in ways that are easy to miss if you stop paying attention. One person continues to evolve, as everyone does, while the other person's image of them stays fixed. And over time, the person being related to as a fixed image starts to feel it. They feel understood in ways that no longer fit, known, but not quite accurately. That feeling doesn't produce conflict. It produces distance. The specific kind of distance that comes from being with someone who thinks they know you and is slightly wrong. Here are the 7 assumptions that create it. Number 1. Assuming you know what they need without asking. Early in relationships, people ask, they check, they verify. They want to know specifically, precisely, what would help, what would feel good, what the other person needs right now. Over time, that checking gets replaced by a certainty that feels earned. You've been with this person long enough to know. So you stop asking. You provide what you've always provided. You respond the way you've always responded. And it works, most of the time. Until it doesn't. Because needs change. What someone needed 2 years ago isn't always what they need now. You keep giving the right answer to a question they stopped asking years ago. The other person doesn't always say this. Sometimes they don't even consciously notice it. But something in them registers. What I'm receiving doesn't quite match what I need. And that mismatch, accumulated over time, becomes a quiet loneliness that has no clear source. Number 2. Assuming you know how they feel about something. This one is specific. Someone mentions something, an event, a decision, a person, a situation, and before they've finished explaining, you've already formed a view of how they feel about it. Because you know them. You know how they think. You know what they like and what they don't. Except sometimes you're wrong. And the conversation that follows isn't really a conversation. It's you relating to your assumption about how they feel, rather than to how they actually feel. Most people don't correct this directly. It feels like too much work to say, actually, that's not quite what I meant. So they let it pass. But over time, being consistently slightly misread creates a specific experience. The feeling that this person isn't quite listening. That they've replaced you with a version of you that's easier to predict. And that version, however affectionate, is not the same as being known. Number 3. Assuming that what's unsaid is fine. 2 people spend an evening together. Nothing bad happens, there's no tension, no one says anything difficult, and one of them interprets that silence as contentment. But the other one has been carrying something that felt slightly too delicate to bring up, or that they weren't sure how to name yet. And because the evening went smoothly, it got left there, unaddressed, assumed to be nothing. The assumption that silence means okay is one of the most common ones in long relationships. And it's understandable because often, silence does mean okay. But when it doesn't, and no one checks, the thing that went unsaid doesn't disappear. It waits. And it joins the other things that went unsaid. And eventually, The weight of everything unspoken becomes the texture of the relationship itself, a low-level hum of things never quite addressed, never quite resolved. Not because either person was unwilling, because both assumed the quiet was peace, when sometimes it was just quiet. Number 4. Assuming their priorities haven't changed. When you first got to know someone, you learned what mattered to them: their work, their relationships, their goals, what they cared about deeply, and what they held more lightly. And you built your understanding of them around that, which is natural, which made sense at the time. But people's priorities shift, sometimes dramatically after a major event, sometimes so gradually that even they don't fully notice until something makes it obvious. And if you're still operating from the old map, still treating their priorities as you understood them years ago, you'll keep missing things. You'll underinvest in what now matters most. You'll overinvest in what they've quietly moved past. They won't always tell you this directly, sometimes because they're still figuring it out themselves, sometimes because they assume you've noticed, sometimes because they've mentioned it, briefly, indirectly, and you absorbed it as small talk rather than information. And the gap widens. Not because either person stopped caring, because one person's reality moved on, and the other person's map of them didn't. Number 5. Assuming your presence is enough. This one is perhaps the most common assumption in long-term relationships, and one of the most quietly costly. You're there. You show up. You're physically present. You're consistent. And you assume that this, the fact of being there, is what the relationship needs most. But presence without attention is not the same as connection. Being in the same room while mentally elsewhere. Listening while thinking about something else. Being available in body, but absent in focus. These things register, even when nothing is said about them. Over time, a person who is consistently physically present, but emotionally distant, creates a specific kind of confusion in the person they're with. Because the absence isn't obvious. You're still there. That's what makes it hard to name. And eventually, they stop trying to reach the part of you that isn't present. Not because they gave up, because the reach kept coming back empty. Number 6. Assuming they know you appreciate them. You do appreciate them. That's not in question. The question is whether that appreciation exists only inside you or whether it actually reaches them in a form they can receive. In long relationships, gratitude often becomes internal. You feel it, genuinely, but you stop expressing it. Because it seems obvious. Because it goes without saying. Because you assume they know. But people don't experience what you feel. They experience what you express. And when appreciation stops being expressed, however genuinely it's felt, it becomes invisible. And invisible appreciation doesn't sustain a relationship the way visible appreciation does. The person who is appreciated but never told can begin to feel taken for granted. Not because you take them for granted, but because the evidence that you don't has stopped arriving. The expression of it became assumed. And after a while, what was meant as obvious starts to feel like neglect. Number 7. Assuming you already know what they're going to say. Someone starts a sentence, and before they finish it, you've already formed the response. You know how this goes. You know what they think about this. You know where this conversation leads. So you half listen. You wait for the part that confirms what you already expected. And when it comes, you respond to that. Not to everything they said, to the version you anticipated. And sometimes you're right. That's what makes this assumption so persistent. It's accurate often enough to feel like knowledge rather than habit. But the times you're wrong, the times they were about to say something different, something new, something that didn't fit the pattern, those moments pass unnoticed. The conversation moves on, and they notice, somewhere underneath it, that you weren't quite listening. Not because you were distracted, because you were certain. And certainty, in those moments, is its own form of absence. Here's what these 7 assumptions share. They all feel like knowledge. They feel like earned certainty, the natural result of time spent together. of attention paid, of genuine intimacy built. And they are, in part, exactly that. Knowing someone well enough to anticipate them is not a problem. It's a feature of closeness. The problem arrives when anticipation replaces curiosity entirely. When you stop asking because you already know. When certainty closes the door that questions used to keep open. Because the person you're with is not static. They are continuously, quietly, gradually becoming a slightly different version of themselves. And if your understanding of them stops updating, you will eventually be in a relationship with who they were, not who they are. That's not a failure of love. It's a failure of attention. And attention, unlike love, is something that has to be actively renewed. Here's what I want you to hold on to from all of this. None of these assumptions make you someone who stopped loving the person beside you. They make you someone who loved them and then, slowly, stopped being surprised by them, stopped leaving room for them to be different from who you expected, stopped treating them as someone still in the process of becoming. And that's not a failure of love. It's something quieter than that. It's what happens when love becomes so familiar that it stops being curious. The distance this creates doesn't feel like distance. It feels like comfort. It feels like knowing someone. Until the person you know starts to feel slightly less like the person who's actually there. That's the moment worth catching. Not after. Before it settles. If any of this felt familiar, I want to offer something simple. Not a communication framework, not a system. Just one question, asked genuinely, with real curiosity, to someone you think you already know completely. Ask them something you've been assuming the answer to. What do you actually need from me right now? What matters most to you this year that didn't matter as much before? Is there something you've been carrying that we haven't talked about? You might get an answer you expected. You might get one that surprises you. Either way, the act of asking says something that assumptions never can. It says, I'm not certain I know you completely, and I'm still curious about who you are. In long relationships, that might be the most important thing you can communicate. The people who stay close over time aren't the ones who figured each other out completely. They're the ones who kept leaving room for the other person to change. So ask again, even if you think you know. Especially then, keep asking.